Hey, and welcome back. So on this video, we're going to transition into market direction. All right, so market direction is really about market research in the more macro view, right? So if you're working in a business that has a traditional marketing team, or in a software company that has now a product marketing team, you might have someone in your organization doing some of this already, but as a product manager, this is stuff that you should be aware of, and maybe even spending some time on yourself. So I wouldn't say this is incredibly critical, but it's good to know. And I'll kind of explain why as we go through, and kind of where things are more salient than others. So as we kind of break these down, there's five things that I look at from a macro view, and that's the industry. Are we in a growth, or are we in a decline as an industry? So in Figma's case, right, online design software. All right. So you have to ask the question, like, is the software like Figma or plugin, whatever you're using as your product that you're working on, is this becoming more relevant or less relevant? Think Netflix versus Blockbuster brick and mortar, right? So Netflix probably still in a growth, might be more mature if we talk about video streaming being a market maturity, but the user growth may still be like adoption still may be in a growth curve. I don't really know. I'm choosing it as an example. Don't know right off if it's like flattening out or if it's still considered in a growth phase versus decline, right? You don't see any Blockbuster brick and mortar stores out there unless it's just an old abandoned building that hasn't been demolished or picked up by some other company. So that's how I look at things. Like, is the industry that my product is in, is that industry in a growth phase or a decline phase, as determined by the user adoption, right? Like, where are users gravitating towards? That's how I kind of define that. So market maturity, I look at this in terms of like broad markets, right? So streaming versus Blu-ray players or DVD players, um, SaaS markets versus client-based desktop software, right? Things like that. Legal, you can look at like privacy concerns, like with GDPR. In the US, California has kind of adopted a similar privacy law. So for international companies, this is especially important to understand international privacy laws, because what data can you collect? What disclosures do you have to make? Pretty much every website you see requires you to accept cookies, right? Some of that has increased because of the GDPR laws. And so, in terms of even as a product manager, right, like what data am I tracking? What usage analytics and what user properties am I tracking? And is that even legal for me to do? Can I capture the name of the user in the usage analytics that I'm tracking? Like, that's stuff that you need to be worried about as you're setting up your quantitative analytics, to determine whether or not you're putting your company at legal risk. And that's something you should probably get advice from your legal team. But still, things to think about as a product manager, and questions that you should ask. Looking at environmental things like COVID, it's a great example. So as I'm recording this, it's September 2020, and COVID is still very much top of mind for everyone. And in some countries, cases are still spiking. But what does this mean for us as a business? Well, as you'll see in one of the user interviews that I ran for this project, as you'll see that a little later as we get to user research, there was a Figma user who switched away from using a competitive solution of a combination of Sketch and InVision. So Sketch is the design software and InVision is the prototyping software. And because Figma is web-based and collaborative in nature, she compared it to something like Google products, where it's, multiple people can get in and do editing at the same time. It has that same feel. COVID has pushed their organization to use Figma because of the collaboration, since they're not all in one room, and the other benefits that it has, right? So how are things in the environment outside of competitors It could be the competitive environment, but what are even things outside of that that could impact your business, like a global pandemic, right? So looking at social, things like inclusiveness, right? And there's many things that might come to mind initially when you hear inclusiveness, but in software, you really want to think of things like accessibility, right? Like what if someone is trying to use this and they can't see or they can't hear or they have some impairment, right? How do you allow them to still use your software, right? How do you make it as accessible as possible? This could come down to copy, right? The words that you use inside of your product, are the words we're using understandable? Are they offensive in nature? Um, and if you're an international product, especially, this is even more important as cultural nuances can seep into um, potential issues with the products you're building and the words you're using in the product. So different things to consider, right? Understanding your industry, where you're at from a market maturity standpoint, legal implications to what you're building and what you're tracking, environmental shifts that could fundamentally disrupt your business, and social implications of your business. Social things could be things like virality too. Like how do you build virality into your product? How do you make your product naturally something that someone gravitates toward or wants to share, or in the use of the product, they naturally are sharing it with people. But all macro things that you want to be thinking about, right? And then how people share, right? So the more macro, not the tactical aspects of social, but think bigger picture and trends. So that's market direction. Getting away from kind of the academic standpoint of like what are the things you should track. Here's some of the things that I was looking at for Figma, right? So as you're trying to figure out some of this stuff for your product or your company that you've taken on, I look at things like this, right? So Business Wire, Berkshire Hathaway, if you're not familiar, that's a Warren Buffett company, massively large company, huge stock prices. So basically, it's a very respected resource to look at. Um, they look at year-over-year growth rate at almost 11% for the SaaS market. So I'm looking at SaaS because Figma is a cloud-based SaaS product. So I want to know where SaaS is trending, right? 40% of the growth is expected from the APAC region, right? Asia Pacific. Um, Market's moderately fragmented. Many players occupying the market share. So some of these indicators are things that help me understand. Okay, so there's no real winner in SaaS for a lot of the subsegments. All right, there is still growth. One of the key drivers of growth they're predicting to be AI-enabled SaaS, which is interesting. So you could ask questions like, well, how do we see AI fitting into our products going forward? So some of these trends, these macro trends, at least get you asking the right questions to avoid potential disruptions or to identify early opportunities for the competitors that aren't looking at this kind of macro level stuff, right? So as I go on, um, right? So global digital experience platform markets to 2025. Companies are becoming more digital amid COVID, and these are behavior changes that, I mean, we've been in COVID since March of 2020. So I think psychologists say that 3 months of doing something like a new routine creates new habits. Doing something consistently for 3 months, we're going on 6 months of of a new routine change. So these are lasting changes and lasting impacts that COVID is going to have. And so we're seeing that more people are going online, looking at SaaS solutions, and that's really fueling and accelerating market growth, even beyond what some of the earlier predictions I showed you had that may have come out before COVID, right? And so if you go back to this, right, they were thinking of a CAGR decrease of 9% year over year. So that's compounded annual growth rate, if you want to know what CAGR is. But if we look back at here, this is saying that they're looking at a shift, right? A 12% growth instead of a 9% decline. And why? Because we're looking at August 18th, 2020, where COVID is fueling growth. So obviously COVID's not good for the world, but it's good for SaaS in terms of business. And if you look at the US stock markets, you'll see that the technology markets are definitely booming in stock prices. So if we continue down this path, I had taken time before to actually find some of these resources, so I didn't bore you with my Google searches. But so you don't want to be looking at like 2016 data when you're in 2020 to try to make decisions, because it probably isn't relevant. As we've seen, things can get turned on its head pretty quickly. But as it stands, we're looking at a $600 billion market by 2023. What does that even mean, right? Well, in 2019, SaaS annual revenues exceeded 100 billion. It's a pretty large jump considering how long SaaS has been around, that we're still looking at a 6x jump in a matter of 4 years when SaaS has been around for a while. All right, so if you keep going, 623 billion. So this is kind of saying some of the same stuff. And if you look down here from Statista, the market was projected to go to almost 160 billion in 2020, which was a doubling of size from 2014. So if we do the math there, we're looking at 80 billion in 2014. And so in 6 years, it doubled, right? But we're saying another 4 years from now, it's going to 6x. So that's pretty massive growth in SaaS. So if we're trying to answer the questions of like, is the industry in a growth or decline phase? I think that's pretty obvious, right? And the fact that most markets are fragmented shows there's a great opportunity for someone to emerge as a market leader in some of these spaces. So all very positive signs that you could probably invest some good resources into making your company and your product stand out as the clear market leader, and using some of these other factors to figure out how you can position your product and company to do just that, right? So that's what I wanted to share for market direction. It is a macro view, but it is very relevant even at a product manager level, because every company is different, right? Some bigger companies will have you as a product manager working on just features, but if you get into a smaller company, maybe a software company with a not as mature product function, you'll have much more responsibility, where this becomes much more important to understand and help the rest of your company understand some of these things if they don't, right? Because not every company invests in proper marketing resources either. So with that said, I'll get off my soapbox around some of these topics, but again, something you should research. It's not something you should necessarily document in your portfolio piece, but if you do find things that are interesting, that are impactful, and help you make certain decisions as you go through this process, then yeah, document them and show why and how that information impacted some of your decision making. That would certainly be relevant to share. So I don't have that in the template that I'm going to share with you. However, I did encourage you to make this your own. So if you find some of this macro market direction stuff relevant to your portfolio piece, by all means add it. And with that, we'll move on to market voice. I'll see you there.